cookbook, which was published in 2017. And this cookbook, like the others in the series, tries to make a difficult topic like assessment more approachable. The instruction section of the book focuses on assessing instruction programs, usually using rubrics or analyzing assignments like annotated bibliographies to measure student learning outcomes year over year. These recipes are very much in line with the idea that assessing instruction should occur to provide evidence of the value of library instruction or of the library as a whole. One recipe even notes that it was designed because the university's accrediting body required demonstration of outcomes assessment, and it, I guess, fell on the library to do that part of it. The book does not, however, really talk at all about assessing to improve one's teaching. Only one recipe does this. So I also want to kind of take a step back and think about this whole series. But let's think about the whole model of a cookbook for taking these complex ideas and distilling them down into simple steps to make it easier for practitioners to do this work. It does make it easier, but it makes it easier to continue mainstream and even sometimes dubious practices. And of course, the fact that these steps are not presented as simple guides, but as recipes in a cookbook that is aimed at a very feminized profession. The other major figure in our current state of assessment is Char Booth. Booth doesn't focus so much on assessment itself. Her work notes the importance of assessment in instructional design, especially in reflective teaching and effective learning. The user method of instructional design that Booth talks about in this book involves a lot of self-reflection, and ultimately this boils down to what we're calling assessment for growth. This focuses on, oh, sorry, I did not know them. Thank you for correcting me. Their work involves a lot of reflection to improve student learning, which will ultimately improve institutional learning outcomes. Booth isn't against the kind of assessment that Oakleaf talks about, but does sort of serve as a stepping stone to critical perspectives on assessment. So based on this status quo approach to assessment, essentially both students and library workers are turned into analytics. We also see assessment right now just used as justification. It's used to prove our value, show our impact, and demonstrate our worth to university and library administrators, as well as others who basically just control the money. If we think about the titles that we've identified as being significant sources of the status quo, Oakleaf's value of academic libraries speaks to the administrator's perspective, not the practitioner's. This report also makes it easier for academic librarians to do assessment because it suggests using data that we don't generate but can access. Our faculty colleagues, which Linnea referred to earlier, are able to do authentic assessment using a semester's worth of work from each student. Generally, librarians are not able to do that, so we use GPAs and other edu data because it's easier. The Library Assessment Cookbook tells us what we're expected to do and how to do it without teaching us how to actually engage in this work. Assessment, as it currently exists in mainstream academic librarianship, is not about improvement, growth, or personal success. It's about upholding the status quo and making it easier for library administrators to apply a financial value to a service that inherently does not have value, which is to say it's invaluable. Recent research, like Danny Brecker-Cook's article, Is the Library One-Shot Effective?, argues basically that we don't know fuck about shit when it comes to library assessment. In this article, Cook uses the literature to show that we rarely do authentic assessment, which is the true test of student learning, where students are asked to demonstrate an application of knowledge in non-standardized ways. So even when we do assess student learning, we're not doing it well and we're not doing it accurately. So really the assessment that we are doing with this status quo model boils down to our survival and just keeping our jobs.
In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire compares status quo education to making deposits in banks. The view of assessment Sarah just discussed echoes this metaphor by using assessment to measure how many of the deposits made in students and librarians have a good return on investment. The critical feminist response to the assessment status quo pushes back against the neoliberal vision of assessment and value. This literature emphasizes the need to step away from top-down, supposedly neutral assessment that commodifies learning, and instead look for ways to make assessment more relational, grounded, and grounded in our individual positions and practices. Next. So we can look at the critical response to assessment in these 4 articles that span about a decade from the year that Oakleaf's Value of Academic Libraries report was published. So the titles themselves demonstrate that status quo assessment needs to be rethought for critical practice. We have Teaching Against the Grain, At Odds with Assessment, moving from critical assessment to assessment as care, these ideas of like, what is critical assessment? How can we do this? So published in 2010, Accardi's Teaching Against the Grain discusses how assessment is tied up with power specifically related to accreditation, but points out that because library instruction is on the margins, librarians have more freedom to bring in critical assessment than teaching faculty might. So again, an interesting contrast with teaching faculty. Accardi describes how she used focus groups to make students participants in assessment and flatten the hierarchy of the classroom. In 2013, Farkas published Accountability versus Improvement, which is an article that kind of talks about her responses to learning about Oakleaf's Value of Academic Libraries report. And Farkas said that she was excited at first because she said, talks about how assessment is really important for improving teaching. And if we can do assessment on a bigger scale of academic libraries and think about how we can use all of that to improve what we do, that would be huge. But she says that when she really dug into the values report, she realized that this was values research and not really assessment. Values research does not help improve practice. It focuses on what's important to campus administrators. Because many librarians already see assessment as something that will be used against them by people in power, it may not seem significantly different from values research to our general group, but Farkas points out that real assessment helps us improve. And then Gardner and Halpern in their article are looking at both assessment in the classroom and assessment outside of the classroom and in the library more generally. And they point out that despite the prevailing neoliberal practices, assessment can still be useful. And I like that phrase. They're like, assessment can still be useful if we approach it from a critical perspective. They recommend using discussion questions, nuanced rubrics, and they describe Charbouth's idea of reflective self-assessment as a practical tool for critical assessment. And that's something that we see a lot in these articles is like, practically, what can we do? How can we make this critical? And we owe a lot of our ideas in this presentation to Ariana Douglas's 2020 article that builds on previous critical feminist work to say that assessment should be relational. She draws on Nodding's idea of an ethic of care and points out that assessment can be a practice of care, showing real value for both our students and ourselves. Assessment can be a way of asking people, how do you feel? And making work more sustainable for ourselves and our students. So critical assessment helps us rethink assessment the way that it currently exists for most of us and can help us understand the labor inequities that we've pointed out. Let's talk about power. So throughout this discussion, we've been alluding to ideas of power and power imbalances. Now let's make that explicit. So as Sarah mentioned, about 80% of librarians are women, and only about 60% of those in library director positions are women. This indicates that while most work in libraries is feminized, the leadership roles are still often occupied by men. When we think of power in assessment, we often think of the imbalance between students and instructors, which should be addressed. But even when we attempt peer evaluations, librarians are at different levels and have different identities. So all of this throws a wrench in this idea of peer and like what is the same. So even in a relatively good scenario where the worker does feel valued, it can be confusing and exhausting to assess someone who has power over you, as we may be required to do for a tenure and promotion. Lisa Sloniowski discusses how gender, race, and class can influence how we perceive labor, specifically affective labor. Sloniowski talks about how fundamental affective labor is to the work of public-facing academic librarianship in particular, even though this labor is not valued in university retention assessment schemes and mechanisms. The undervaluing of this gendered and racialized labor may lead to workers feeling that they aren't contributing enough to their library or university and that they aren't being productive enough. And that in turn leads to exhaustion and burnout, as have been discussed in a lot of work recently throughout the pandemic. We've been talking about that a lot. Ariana Douglas and Gadsby bring up the idea that feminized labor is tied to housework. Assessment could also be seen as housework or housekeeping, since a lot of it is making sure everything is going smoothly and things that are supposed to be getting done are getting done. Assessment is designed to help us see how things are going and how we might change things for the better, but often assessment is performed in ways that help those in power to quantify labor or prove value to people above them or their donors, stakeholders, but it doesn't help workers to understand what they can do to reduce hierarchies and help themselves and others.
So the literature of critical librarianship, as we have been pointing out, contains multiple practical strategies to create an assessment paradigm that is more inclusive. So we're going to take a look at a few of these strategies and define what kind of assessment we feel most compelled by. So this has kind of come up in the presentation a couple of times, but let's be more explicit. Assessment, even in the literature of critical librarianship, is obviously complicated. It is so deeply entrenched in neoliberal concepts of success and in the willingness and ability and time management and labor of the librarian that it often feels unsustainable. We wanted to reflect on a particular form of assessment that is common in library instruction departments. Department level teaching assessment, separate from assessing students meeting learning goals or the kind of self-assessments we frequently see on job evaluations. We struggled to come up with a term for the kind of assessment we wanted to talk about, which was the assessment that happens when instructors observe one another or otherwise engage in peer assessment activities. In order to distinguish this assessment, we started calling it assessment for growth. The purpose of such assessment is to facilitate growth as a teacher. As Veronica Ariana Douglas says, we need to be prepared to value ourselves as teaching librarians and assess our own needs, experiences, feelings, and situational contexts. Implicit in this statement is activism and advocacy. It centers the librarian without ignoring or sacrificing for the needs of the student, peer colleague, supervisor, etc. The ideas of Veronica Ariana Douglas have a lot of value for us. Ariana Douglas recommends building an assessment framework that centers connection and care above ideas of worth and value, asking not what is our value, but what is it we value. As a model, nursing and midwifery are similarly feminized vocations that embed care in an assessment, leaving both practitioner and patient empowered and confident. Relational assessment imagines care within our roles that show that, quote, all parties of a relationship matter, whether librarians and faculty, librarian colleagues and staff, or librarians and students. These conversations are not about survival, but human connection. We should think about assessment as a kind of intentional focus on our shared values as librarians and teachers while maintaining the boundaries that cushion us from burnout. Ariana Douglas reminds us that these kinds of connections don't often feel like assessment because they aren't standardized forms of generating data after all, but they provide the kind of feedback needed to develop instruction based on real issues rather than imagined ones. Effective labor is undervalued, so assessment as care is pushing back even more against the neoliberal framework. The critical perspective avoids being fixated on analytics by situating the instructor as a learner alongside the student, creating space for the student to bring in prior knowledge and set learning goals for themselves. While classroom assessment is typically focused on student learning and outcomes, McCartan and Deneen focus a chapter of their book on the assessment of teaching. Megan Oakleaf said, "If you are not assessing, you are not teaching." McCartan and Deneen's view is more akin to, if you are not assessing, you are not learning about yourself as a teacher. Similarly to standard modes of teaching assessment, critical modes of teaching assessment in the literature reflect a focus on gauging student learning or library impact at the classroom or institutional level. However, critical librarians reframe methods of assessment in ways that are inclusive, thoughtful, and more ethically considerate. Recommended efforts range in scale. At the most manageable level, McCartan and Deneen emphasize the importance of post-instruction self-reflection by writing down personal critiques of lesson plans, teaching methods, and observed student reactions after every session. The intent of such journaling is for improvement, with the advice of scheduling 15 to 30 minutes after every session to write down thoughts in a targeted and intentional way. For departmental and institutional instruction assessment, they recommend developing peer observation programs or critical friend groups, the principal difference of which is the extent to which the observers and observees collaborate on the methods and outcomes of the assessment. McCartan and Deneen also recommend larger efforts such as focus groups, which I heard about in a presentation earlier today. Focus groups are cited as quality sources of student perspective and feedback, though they are admittedly time and labor intensive. They also recommend creating evaluation criteria with and alongside students, especially in credit-bearing courses where the time for such efforts is built in. The authors point out that all of these assessment techniques are adjacent to critical consciousness, as demonstrated in this chart. Focusing on the peer observation and critical friends groups as reflective of sharing power, there is the sense that the critical perspective doesn't adequately consider the power inequities within and among librarian peers and supervisors with complex relationships and histories, teaching faculty with different but overlapping requirements for success, and staff who are often underpaid and over-relied on. Even at the smallest possible scale, the commitment to rigorous journaling requires discipline, is time intensive, and can easily, in my personal experience, lead to a pattern of negative self-talk. These practices include the learner in a participatory manner, using student input and feedback to create holistic learning environments where assessment engages not just the learner as perceived, but the learner as actively involved. It is worth pointing out that in these instances we are focused on, the teacher and the learner are peers, colleagues, or the very same person. Assessment as care would philosophically center the empathy of both the learner and the student, but all involved would need to be intentionally involved, consenting, and vulnerable. In most hierarchical systems with power unevenly dispersed, the intention to share power is not enough when we take into account the distribution of affective and emotional labor across age, race, class, gender, and educational attainment. As Ariana Douglas observes, without boundaries, care is not sustainable, but the boundaries must be mutually agreed upon and respected.
Sorry, I got distracted reading the chat. Okay, so this brings us back to some of the questions that we posed earlier. What are we assessing and why? Are we assessing student learning or ourselves as instructors? Or is all of this assessment work just so that library administrators can make some statements about the value of the library? When you consider the power dynamics involved, even when we measure others, we are really always measuring ourselves, but it's usually for the benefit of larger departments and the institution. So I already asked this question, but what do we, as the workers doing this labor, get out of all this work doing assessment? There is a feeling sometimes of crisis with that. So that's why we came up, or I don't think we came up with this idea, but we put into words this idea of assessment for growth. How do we know, though, how to assess for growth, especially when we're dealing with this staunchly neoliberal environment? How do we resist thinking of students as analytics? And also ourselves as analytics, find time to reflect on our own teaching, and also find time to encourage others to find the time to reflect on their teaching, while also dealing with these power dynamics within the unit. How do you peer review your boss if, like me, you work in a small unit and you have to peer review your boss, who is not your peer because they're your boss, but also according to the org chart sort of is your peer? And right there's that power dynamic, but also you have to do it because you have to have peer review of instruction in order to go up for tenure or promotion. And finally, just how do you say no to some of this? We've seen a lot of the comments in here about how much work it is. How do you say no when you're feeling overworked and understaffed? With that, I'm going to actually turn this over again, but I do have a link.
So obviously we have a lot of questions and not like a lot of answers, but this is something that's very much on our mind. We have created a reflective questions for breakout rooms document. And what we're going to do is just, if we can, pop y'all into breakout rooms to have some conversations and work on your reflective questions. Let's see. I actually haven't done breakout rooms since Andy.
I think we need our host to do that.
Host.
Yes, please.
And host, probably thinking 4 people, 4 or 5. Let's say 5, because I think in the number of breakout rooms we have in our doc and the number of people in here now, we need to, rapidly dropping. Welcome to breakout rooms. Yeah.
Oh, no.
Just 4 or 5 people per breakout room.
Okay. So now there should be an option to join a breakout room. And I guess just go into the breakout room of your choice.
I like this not sweeping everyone out into a breakout room. I feel like it's better when it's like a personal choice.
Yeah, of course, with the number of people that left when we said breakout room time, I feel like we could have just done this as a discussion in the main room.
Well, I think here's my experience at CLAPS. While we're in this break time, let's talk about I love breakout rooms because it's the breakout rooms that help me like remember people like the next time I see them, or like in another conference or online. So I don't know. They're not for everybody. Oh yeah. Did we give a time?
I don't think we did. We're at 2:42, and I figure we should, if we're able to close the breakout rooms, maybe at like 2:45.
That sounds good. Yeah. Can we broadcast a message that says 3 more minutes?
Yeah.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yes. Thanks. Yeah. I'm gonna full disclosure for myself at least. I did not realize that this was 50 minutes until I was in an earlier session. So I tried to just talk a little bit faster.
All right,
Okay, we're getting some comments.
Oh,
Room 4 is on it.
Shout out to room 4. Although I also know from my experience in breakout rooms, a lot of times you get too busy talking and you don't actually document what you're talking about. So I'm pretty sure that the other rooms are also on it.
Talk about deans.
So we're at time. Do you want me to go ahead and close the rooms?
That sounds good, because then people will have a minute to leave.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Does it seem like everybody is in one of the first 4 rooms?
Yeah, I think there were only 5 rooms.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm loving seeing all the comments coming in on the questions document. And I think, okay, so I think folks are more or less back here. So in our last couple minutes, I think we can open it up to some questions. And while people are thinking of questions, I will drop a link to our references. So this is our full list of references.
I'm seeing some great comments in here. I would just like to say thank y'all, because it really felt like one of those things that we shared, but reflecting on it, it's very widely experienced.
Mhm. Yeah, and some of the comments that people have made in the chat, there were some that just, as I was reading them, all I could think of was that essay from the 70s, I Want a Wife. And it was like, yeah, not only do I want a wife, I also want a work wife that does my work.
Yes, where's my
Or-
work wife?
Yes. And I do want a unicorn.
Same.
I
I
just
don't see
dropped
any
our
questions in the, I was just gonna say, I don't see any questions so far in the chat, so that haven't
Yeah.
already been addressed.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah.
I
thank
just
you.
dropped the link to our slides in the chat. I'll drop it again here. It's not a tiny URL, it's a long one.
And I think this is, you see, I think
Oh, yeah.
we can just share this folder, right?
Mhm. Well, there's a lot of stuff in there.
Oh no,
We
we
might
have
need to clean
another
it out.
folder. Sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I created another secret folder while we
Oh.
were
Okay.
in the breakout room.
Yeah.
So here is, Linnea is really good at double tasking. Like did this during the presentation. So here's a link to a folder in Google Drive that has our slides with our slide notes and our references. And I think that we can absolutely put a copy of these comments from the breakout rooms in that folder as well.
Awesome. And Annie in the chat says, I would love to know if this type of assessment is being talked about at the major assessment conferences like ARL. There seems to be a divide sometimes. I haven't been to any major assessment conferences, but does anyone in the room have experience with that? Do you know what kind of assessment they're talking about?
Apparently there's one happening right now.
Yeah, one of my colleagues is helping run it, I think, right now, actually. So
Yeah, and Atricia has a question. You have your hand raised. Feel free to unmute and just ask. Thanks.
Hi, we are talking about this in our teaching and learning department, kind of reframing, how we can approach assessment in a way that